Chapter 10. The Climax. The first Masonic body with which the Illuminati formed an alliance was the Strict Observance, to which the Illuminati Nig and Bode both belonged. Cagliostro had also been initiated into the Strict Observance near Frankfurt, and was now employed as agent of the combined order. According to his own confession, his mission was to work so as to turn Freemasonry in the direction of Weishaupt's projects, and the funds he drew upon were those of the Illuminati. Cagliostro also formed a link with the Martinistes, whose doctrines, though derided by Weishaupt, were useful to his plan in attracting by their mystical character those who would have been repelled by the cynicism of the Illuminati. According to Beruel, it was the Martinistes who, following in the footsteps of the Rosicrucians, had suggested to Weishaupt the device of presenting Christ as an Illuminatus, which had led to such triumphant results amongst the Protestant clergy. But if Weishaupt made use of the various Masonic associations, they on their account found in him a valuable ally. The fact is that by this time both French and German Freemasons were very much at sea with regard to the whole subject of Masonry, and needed someone to give a point to their deliberations. Thus at the Congress of Wilhelmsbad convened on July 16, 1782, and attended by representatives of Masonic bodies from all over the world. The first question propounded by the Grand Master of the Templars, i.e. the Strict Observance, was, what is the real object of the order, and its true origin? So, says Mirabeau in relating this incident, this same Grand Master, and all his assistants had worked for more than 20 years with incredible ardor at a thing of which they knew neither the real object nor the origin. 2 years later the Freemasons of France do not appear to have been any less in the dark on this matter, for we find them writing to General Rainsford, one of the English Masons who had been present at the Congress of Wilhelmsbad, as follows. Since you say that Masonry has never experienced any variation in its aim, do you then know with certainty what this unique object is? Is it useful for the happiness of mankind? Tell us if it is of an historical, political, hermetical, or scientific nature. Moral, social, or religious? Are the traditions oral or written? But Weishaupt had a very definite object in view, which was to gain control of all Freemasonry, and though he himself was not present at the Congress, his coadjutor Nig, who had been traveling about Germany proclaiming himself the reformer of Freemasonry, presented himself at Wilhelmsbad. Armed with full authority from Weishaupt, and succeeded in enrolling a number of magistrates, savants, ecclesiastics, and ministers of state as Illuminati, and in allying himself with the deputies of St. Martin and Willemoz. Vanquished by this powerful rival, the Strict Observance ceased temporarily to exist, and Illuminism was left in possession of the field. On February 15, 1785, a further congress took place in Paris, convened this time by the Philhellenes, at which the Illuminati Bode, alias Emilius, and the Baron de Buch, alias Bayard, were present. Also it has been stated the magician Cagliostro, the Magnetisser Mesmer, the Kabbalist de Canto, and of course the leaders of the Philhellenes, Savelet de Langes, who was elected president, the Marquis de Chefdedian, and a number of German members of the same order. This congress led to no very practical results, and a further and more secret one was convened in the following year at Frankfurt, where a Grand Lodge had been established in 1783. It was here that the deaths of Louis XVI and Gustavus III of Sweden are said to have been decreed. But already in this same year of 1786 the first act of the revolutionary drama had been played out. The famous affair of the necklace can never be understood in the pages of official history. Only an examination of the mechanism provided by the secret societies can explain that extraordinary episode, which, in the opinion of Napoleon, contributed more than any other cause to the explosion of 1789. In its double attack on church and monarchy, the affair of the necklace fulfilled the purpose of both Frederick the Great and of the Illuminati. Cagliostro, we know, received both money and instructions from the order for carrying out the plot, and after it had ended in his own and the Cardinal de Rohan's exoneration and exile, we find him embarking on fresh secret society work in London, where he arrived in November of the same year. Announcing himself as the Count Sukowski, member of a society at Avignon, he visited the Swedenborgians at their Theosophical Society meeting in rooms in the Middle Temple, and displayed minute acquaintance with their doctrines, whilst claiming a superior knowledge. According to a generally received opinion, Cagliostro was the author of a mysterious proclamation, which appeared at this moment in the Morning Herald in the cipher of the Rose-Croix. But in the year before these events an extraordinary thing had happened. An evangelist preacher and Illuminatus named Lanes had been sent in July 1785 as an emissary of the Illuminati to Silesia, but on his journey he was struck down by lightning. The instructions of the order were found on him, and as a result its intrigues were conclusively revealed to the government of Bavaria. A searching inquiry followed, the houses of Zwack and Bassus were raided, and it was then that the documents and other incriminating evidence referred to in the preceding chapter of this book were seized and made public under the name of the original writings of the Order of the Illuminati, 1787. But before this the evidence of 4 ex-Illuminati, professors of Munich, was published in 2 separate volumes. The diabolical nature of Illuminism now remained no longer a matter of doubt, and the order was officially suppressed. The opponents of Berulle and Robison therefore declare that Illuminism came finally to an end. We shall see later by documentary evidence that it never ceased to exist, and that 25 years later not only the Illuminati, but Weishaupt himself were still as active as ever behind the scenes in Freemasonry. But for the present we must follow its course from the moment of its apparent extinction in 1786. This course can be traced not only through the German Union, which is believed to have been a reorganization of the original Illuminati, but through the secret societies of France. Illuminism in reality is less an order than a principle, and a principle which can work better under cover of something else. Weishaupt himself had laid down the precept that the work of Illuminism could best be conducted under other names and other occupations, and henceforth we shall always find it carried on by this skillful system of camouflage. The first cover adopted was the Lodge of the Amos or 6 Unis in Paris, with which, as we have already seen, the Illuminati had established relations. But now in 1787 a definite alliance was effected by the aforementioned Illuminati, Bode and Busch, who in response to an invitation from the secret committee of the lodge arrived in Paris in February of this year. Here they found the old Illuminatus Mirabeau, who with Talleyrand had been largely instrumental in summoning these German brothers and, according to Gustav Bord, 2 important members of the strict observance, the Marquis de Chefdebien d'Armesson, Iques a Capite Galato, and an Austrian, the Count Leopold de Kolorath-Krakowski, Iques a Bakila Fulgenti, who also belonged to Weishaupt's Order of Illuminati, in which he bore the pseudonym of Numenius. It is important here to recognize the peculiar part played by the Lodge of the Amos Reunius. Whilst the Loge de Neuf Sœurs was largely composed of middle-class revolutionaries such as Brisset, Danton, Camille Desmoulins, and Champfort, and the Loge de la Candeur of aristocratic revolutionaries Lafayette, as well as the Orl Poundenists, the Marquis de Sillery, the Duc d'Aiguillon, the Marquis de Custine, and the Lameths. The Loge de Contrat Social was mainly composed of honest visionaries who entertained no revolutionary projects, but, according to Berulle, were strongly royalist. The role of the Amos Reunius was to collect together the subversives from all other lodges Philolithes, Rose-Croix, members of the Loge de Neuf Sœurs, and of the Loge de la Candeur, and of the most secret committees of the Grand Orient, as well as deputies from the Illumines in the provinces. Here, then, the lodge in the Rue de la Sourdière, under the direction of Savalette de Langes, were to be found the disciples of Weishaupt, of Swedenborg, and of Saint Martin, as well as the practical makers of revolution, the agitators and demagogues of 1789. The influence of German Illuminism on all these heterogeneous elements was enormous. From this moment, says a further Bavarian report of the matter, a complete change took place in the order of the Amos Reunius. Hitherto only vaguely subversive, the Chevaliers Bienfaisants became the Chevaliers Malfaisants, the Amos are six Unis became the enemies are six Unis. The arrival of the two Germans, Bode and Busch, gave the finishing touch to the conspiracy. The avowed object of their journey was to obtain information about magnetism, which was just then making a great stir, but in reality, taken up with the gigantic plan of their order, their real aim was to make proselytes. It will be seen that the following passage exactly confirms the account given by Berulle. As the lodge of the Amos Reunies collected together everything that could be found out from all other Masonic systems in the world, so the way was soon paved there for Illuminism. It was also not long before this lodge, together with all those that depended on it, was impregnated with Illuminism. The former system of all these was as if wiped out, so that from this time onwards the framework of the Philopainthes quite disappeared, and in the place of the former Kabbalistic magical extravagance, Schroedermarii, came in the philosophical political. It was therefore not Martinism, Kabbalism, or Freemasonry that in themselves provided the real revolutionary force. Many non-illuminized Freemasons, as Berulle himself declares, remained loyal to the throne and altar. And as soon as the monarchy was seen to be in danger, the royalist brothers of the Contrat Social boldly summoned the lodges to coalesce in defense of king and constitution. Even some of the upper Masons, who in the degree of Knight Kadash had sworn hatred to the Pope and Bourbon monarchy, rallied likewise to the royal cause. The French spirit triumphed over the Masonic spirit in the greater number of the brothers. Opinions as well as hearts were still for the king. It needed the devastating doctrines of Weishaupt to undermine this spirit, and to turn the degrees of vengeance from vain ceremonial into terrible fact. If, then, it is said that the revolution was prepared in the lodges of Freemasons, and many French Masons have boasted of the fact, let it always be added that it was Illuminized Freemasonry that made the revolution, and that the Masons who acclaim it are Illuminized Masons, inheritors of the same tradition introduced into the lodges of France in 1787 by the disciples of Weishaupt, Patriarch of the Jacobins. Many of the Freemasons of France in 1787 were thus not conscious allies of the Illuminati. According to Cadet de Gassecourt, there were in all the lodges only 27 real initiates. The rest were largely dupes who knew little or nothing of the source whence the fresh influence among them derived. The amazing feature of the whole situation is that the most enthusiastic supporters of the movement were men belonging to the upper classes, and even to the royal families of Europe. A contemporary relates that no less than 30 princes reigning and non-reigning had taken under their protection a confederation from which they stood to lose everything, and had become so imbued by its principles that they were inaccessible to reason. Intoxicated by the flattery lavished on them by the priests of Illuminism, they adopted a religion of which they understood nothing. Weishaupt, of course, had taken care that none of these royal dupes should be initiated into the real aims of the order, and at first adhered to the original plan of excluding them altogether. But the value of their cooperation soon became apparent, and by a supreme irony it was with the Grand Duke that he himself took refuge. But if the great majority of princes and nobles were stricken with blindness at this crisis, a few far-seeing spirits recognized the danger and warned the world of the impending disaster. In 1787, Cardinal Caprara, Apostolic Nuncio at Vienna, addressed a confidential memoir to the Pope, in which he pointed out that the activities carried on in Germany by the different sects of Illumines, of Perfectibilists, of Freemasons, etc., were increasing. The danger is approaching, for from all these senseless dreams of Illuminism, of Swedenborgianism, or of Freemasonry a frightful reality will emerge. Visionaries have their time, the revolution they forebode will have its time also. A more amazing prophecy, however, was the Essai sur la secte Illumines, by the Marquis de Lachey, a liberal noble who played some part in the revolutionary movement, yet who nevertheless realized the dangers of Illuminism. Thus, as early as 1789, before the revolution had really developed, de Lachey uttered these words of warning. Deluded people. Learn that there exists a conspiracy in favor of despotism against liberty, of incapacity against talent, of vice against virtue, of ignorance against enlightenment. This society aims at governing the world. Its object is universal domination. This plan may seem extraordinary, incredible, yes, but not chimerical. No such calamity has ever yet afflicted the world. De Lachey then goes on to foretell precisely the events that were to take place 3 and 4 years later. He describes the position of a king who has to recognize masters above himself and to authorize their abominable regime. To become the plaything of an ambitious and fanatical horde which has taken possession of his will. See him condemned to serve the passions of all that surround him, to raise degraded men to power, to prostitute his judgment by choices that dishonor his prudence. All this was exactly fulfilled during the reign of the Girondin ministry of 1792. The campaign of destruction carried out in the summer of 1793 is thus foretold. We do not mean to say that the country where the Illumines reign will cease to exist, but it will fall into such a degree of humiliation that it will no longer count in politics, that the population will diminish, that the inhabitants who resist the inclination to pass into a foreign land will no longer enjoy the happiness of consideration, nor the charms of society, nor the gifts of commerce. And de Lachey ends with this despairing appeal to the powers of Europe. Masters of the world, cast your eyes on a desolated multitude, listen to their cries, their tears, their hopes. A mother asks you to restore her son, a wife her husband, your cities for the fine arts that have fled from them, the country for citizens, the fields for cultivators, religion for forms of worship, and nature for beings of which she is worthy. 5 years after these words were written, the countryside of France was desolate, art and commerce were destroyed, and women following the tumbril that carried Fouquier Tinville to the guillotine cried out, "Give me back my brother, my son, my husband." So was this amazing prophecy fulfilled. Yet not one word has history to say on the subject. The warning of de Lachey has fallen on deaf ears amongst posterity, as amongst the men of his own day. De Lachey himself recognizes the obstacle to his obtaining a hearing. There are too many people interested in supporting the system of the Illumines, too many deluded rulers imagining themselves enlightened, ready to precipitate their people into the abyss. Whilst the heads of the order will never relinquish the authority they have acquired nor the treasure at their disposal, in vain de Lachey appeals to the Freemasons to save their order from the invading sect. Would it not be possible, he asks, to direct the Freemasons themselves against the Illumines by showing them that whilst they are working to maintain harmony in society, those others are everywhere sowing seeds of discord and preparing the ultimate destruction of their order? So far it is not too late, if only men will believe in the danger it may be averted. From the moment they are convinced, the necessary blow is dealt to the section. Otherwise de Lachey prophesies a series of calamities of which the end is lost in the darkness of time. A subterranean fire smoldering eternally, and breaking forth periodically in violent and devastating explosions. What words could better describe the history of the last 150 years? The Essai sur la secte lumens is one of the most extraordinary documents of history, and at the same time one of the most mysterious. Why it should have been written by the Marquis de Lachey, who is said to have collaborated with Mirabeau in the Galerie de Portraits published in the following year, why it should have been appended to Mirabeau's Histoire secrète de la Cour de Berlin, and accordingly attributed to Mirabeau himself, why Berulle should have denounced it as dust thrown in the eyes of the public, although it entirely corroborated his own point of view, are questions to which I can find no reply. That it was written seriously, and in all good faith it is impossible to doubt, whilst the fact that it appeared before, instead of after, the events described, renders it even more valuable evidence of the reality of the conspiracy than Berulle's own admirable work. What Berulle saw, de Lachey foresaw with equal clearness. As to the role of Mirabeau at this crisis, we can only hazard an explanation on the score of his habitual inconsistency. At one moment he was seeking interviews with the king's ministers in order to warn them of the coming danger, at the next he was energetically stirring up insurrection. It is therefore not impossible that he may have encouraged de Lachey's exposure of the conspiracy, although meanwhile he himself had entered into the scheme of destruction. Indeed, according to a pamphlet published in 1791 entitled Mystères de la Conspiration, the whole plan of revolution was found amongst his papers. The editor of this brochure explains that the document here made public, called Croquis au projet de révolution de Monsieur de Mirabeau, was seized at the house of Madame Legy, the wife of Mirabeau's publisher, on October 6, 1789. Beginning with a diatribe against the French monarchy, the document goes on to say that, in order to triumph over this hydra-headed monster, these are my ideas. We must overthrow all order, suppress all laws, annul all power, and leave the people in anarchy. The laws we establish will not perhaps be in force at once, but at any rate, having given back the power to the people, they will resist for the sake of their liberty which they will believe they are preserving. We must caress their vanity, flatter their hopes, promise them happiness after our work has been in operation. We must elude their caprices and their systems at will, for the people as legislators are very dangerous. They only establish laws which coincide with their passions. Their want of knowledge would besides only give birth to abuses. But as the people are a lever which legislators can move at their will, we must necessarily use them as a support, and render hateful to them everything we wish to destroy, and sow illusions in their path. We must also buy all the mercenary pens which propagate our methods, and which will instruct the people concerning their enemies whom we attack. The clergy, being the most powerful through public opinion, can only be destroyed by ridiculing religion, rendering its ministers odious, and only representing them as hypocritical monsters. For Mahomet, in order to establish his religion, first defamed the paganism which the Arabs, the Sarmathis, and the Scythians professed. Libels must at every moment show fresh traces of hatred against the clergy. To exaggerate their riches, to make the sins of an individual appear to be common to all, to attribute to them all vices, calumny, murder, irreligion, sacrilege, all is permitted in times of revolution. We must degrade the noblesse and attribute it to an odious origin, establish a germ of equality, which can never exist, but which will flatter the people. We must immolate the most obstinate, burn and destroy their property in order to intimidate the rest, so that if we cannot entirely destroy this prejudice, we can weaken it, and the people will avenge their vanity and their jealousy by all the excesses which will bring them to submission. After describing how the soldiers are to be seduced from their allegiance, and the magistrates represented to the people as despots, since the people, brutal and ignorant, only see the evil and never the good of things, the writer explains they must be given only limited power in the municipalities. Let us beware above all of giving them too much force. Their despotism is too dangerous. We must flatter the people by gratuitous justice, promise them a great diminution in taxes, and a more equal division, more extension in fortunes, and less humiliation. These fantasies, vertiges, will fanaticize the people, who will flatten out all resistance. What matter the victims and their numbers? Spoliations, destructions, burnings, and all the necessary effects of a revolution? Nothing must be sacred, and we can say with Machiavelli, what matter the means as long as one arrives at the end? Were all these the ideas of Mirabeau, or were they, like the other document of the Illuminati found amongst his papers, the program of a conspiracy? I incline to the latter theory. The plan of campaign was, at any rate, the one followed out by the conspirators, as Chamfort, the friend and confidant of Mirabeau, admitted in his conversation with Marmontel. The nation is a great herd that only thinks of browsing, and with good sheepdogs the shepherds can lead it as they please. Money and the hope of plunder are all powerful with the people. Mirabeau cheerfully asserts that with Io Louis one can make quite a good riot. Another contemporary thus describes the methods of the leaders. Mirabeau, in the exuberance of an orgy, cried one day, "That canaille well deserves to have us for legislators." These professions of faith, as we see, are not at all democratic. The sect uses the populace as revolution fodder, chair de revolution, as prime material for brigandage, after which it seizes the gold and abandons generations to torture. It is veritably the code of hell. It is this code of hell set forth in the Projet de Révolution that we shall find repeated in succeeding documents throughout the last 100 years in the correspondence of the Alta Vendita, in the dialogues aux enfers entre Machiavel et Montesquieu by Maurice Joly, in the Revolutionary Catechism of Bakunin, in the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and in the writings of the Russian Bolsheviks today. Whatever doubts may be cast on the authenticity of any of these documents, the indisputable fact thus remains that as early as 1789 this Machiavellian plan of engineering revolution, and using the people as a lever for raising a tyrannical minority to power, had been formulated. Further, that the methods described in this earliest protocol have been carried out according to plan from that day to this. And in every outbreak of the social revolution the authors of the movement have been known to be connected with secret societies. It was Adrien Duport, author of The Great Fear that spread over France on July 22, 1789, Duport, the inner initiate of the secret societies, holding in his hands all the threads of the Masonic conspiracy, who on May 21, 1790, set forth before the Committee of Propaganda the vast scheme of destruction. M. de Mirabeau has well established the fact that the fortunate revolution, which has taken place in France must, and will be for all the peoples of Europe the awakening of liberty, and for kings the sleep of death. But Duport goes on to explain that whilst Mirabeau thinks it advisable at present not to concern themselves with anything outside France, he himself believes that the triumph of the French Revolution must lead inevitably to the ruin of all thrones. Therefore we must hasten among our neighbours the same revolution that is going on in France. The plan of Illuminized Freemasonry was thus nothing less than world revolution. It is necessary here to reply to a critic who suggested that in emphasizing the role of the secret societies in world revolution, I had abandoned my former thesis of the Orleanist conspiracy. I wish therefore to state that I do not retract one word I wrote in the French Revolution on the Orleanist conspiracy. I merely supply a further explanation of its efficiency by enlarging on the aid it received from the party I referred to as the subversives outcome of the Masonic lodges. It was because the Orleanists held the whole Masonic organization at their disposal that they were able to carry out their plans with such extraordinary skill and thoroughness. And because they had at their back men bent solely on destruction, that they could enlist a following which would not have rallied to a mere scheme of usurpation. Even Montjoy, who saw in the Revolution principally the work of the Duc d'Orléans, indicates in a very curious passage of a later work the existence of the still darker intrigue behind the conspiracy he had spent his energies in unveiling. I will not examine whether this wicked prince, thinking he was acting in his personal interests, was not moved by that invisible hand which seems to have created all the events of our revolution in order to lead us towards a goal that we do not see at present, but which I think we shall see before long. Unfortunately, after this mysterious utterance Montjoy never again returns to the subject. At the beginning of the Revolution, Orleanism and Freemasonry thus formed a united body. According to Lombard de Langres, France in 1789 counted more than 2,000 lodges affiliated to the Grand Orient. The number of adepts was more than 100,000. The first events of 1789 were only Masonry in action. All the revolutionaries of the Constituent Assembly were initiated into the third degree. We place in this class the Duc d'Orléans, Valence, Sillery, Laclos, C&S, Pétion, Menot, Byron, Montesquieu, Fauchet, Condorcet, Lafayette, Mirabeau, Garrett, Rabot, Dubois, Crained, Thibault, La Rochefoucauld, and others. Amongst these others were not only the Brissotins, who formed the nucleus of the Girondin party, but the men of the Terror Marat, Robespierre, Danton, and Desmoulins. It was these fiercer elements, true disciples of the Illuminati, who were to sweep away the visionary Masons dreaming of equality and brotherhood. Following the precedent set by Weishaupt, classical pseudonyms were adopted by these leaders of the Jacobins. Thus Chaumette was known as Anaxagoras, Cloots as Anacharsis, Danton as Horace, Lacroix as Publicola, and Rancin as Scaevola, again, after the manner of the Illuminati. The names of towns were changed and a revolutionary calendar was adopted. The red cap and loose hair affected by the Jacobins appear also to have been foreshadowed in the lodges of the Illuminati. Yet faithfully as the terrorists carried out the plan of the Illuminati, it would seem that they themselves were not initiated into the innermost secrets of the conspiracy. Behind the convention, behind the clubs, behind the Revolutionary Tribunal, there existed, says Lombard de Langres, that most secret convention, Convention Secretissime, which directed everything after May 31st. An occult and terrible power of which the other convention became the slave, and which was composed of the prime initiates of Illuminism. This power was above Robespierre and the committees of the government. It was this occult power which appropriated to itself the treasures of the nation and distributed them to the brothers and friends who had helped on the great work. What was the aim of this occult power? Was it merely the plan of destruction that had originated in the brain of a Bavarian professor 20 years earlier, or was it something far older, a live and terrible force that had lain dormant through the centuries, that Weishaupt and his allies had not created, but only loosed upon the world? The Reign of Terror, like the outbreak of Satanism in the Middle Ages, can be explained by no material causes. The orgy of hatred, lust, and cruelty directed not only against the rich, but still more against the poor and defenseless, the destruction of science, art, and beauty. The desecration of the churches, the organized campaign against all that was noble, all that was sacred, all that humanity holds dear, what was this but Satanism? In desecrating the churches and stamping on the crucifixes, the Jacobins had in fact followed the precise formula of black magic. For the purpose of infernal evocation, it is requisite to profane the ceremonies of the religion to which one belongs and to trample its holiest symbols under foot. It was this that formed the prelude to the Great Terror, when, to those who lived through it, it seemed that France lay under the sway of the powers of darkness. So in the great shipwreck of civilization, as a contemporary has described it, the projects of the Kabbalists, the Gnostics, and the secret societies, which for nearly 18 centuries had sapped the foundations of Christianity, found their fulfillment. Do we not detect an echo of the Toldat issue in the blasphemies of the Marquis de Sade concerning the Jewish slave, and the adulterous woman, the courtesan of Galilee? And in the imprecations of Marat's worshippers, Christ was a false prophet. A repetition of the secret doctrine attributed to the Templars: Jesus is not the true God, he is a false prophet, he was not crucified for the salvation of humanity, but for his own misdeeds. Are these resemblances accidental, or are they the outcome of a continuous plot against the Christian faith? What, then, was the role of Jews in the Revolution? In this connection it is necessary to understand the situation of the Jews in France at this period. After the decree of banishment issued by Charles VI in 1394, Jewry, as a body, had ceased to exist, but towards the end of the 15th century a certain number of Jews, driven out of Spain and Portugal, were allowed to settle in Bordeaux. These Spanish and Portuguese Jews, known as Sephardim, appeared to acquiesce in the Christian religion, and were not officially regarded as Jews, but enjoyed considerable privileges conferred on them by Henry II. It was not until the beginning of the 18th century, during the Regency, that Jews began to reappear in Paris. Meanwhile, the annexation of Alsace at the end of the previous century had added to the population of France the German Jews of that province known as the Ashkenazim. It is important to distinguish between these two races of Jews in discussing the question of Jewish emancipation at the time of the Revolution. For whilst the Sephardim had shown themselves good citizens, and were therefore subject to no persecutions, the Ashkenazim by their extortionate usury and oppressions had made themselves detested by the people, so that rigorous laws were enforced to restrain their rapacity. The discussions that raged in the National Assembly on the subject of the Jewish question related therefore mainly to the Jews of Alsace. Already in 1784, the Jews of Bordeaux had been accorded further concessions by Louis XVI. In 1776 all Portuguese Jews had been given religious liberty, and the permission to inhabit all parts of the kingdom. The decree of January 28, 1790, conferring on the Jews of Bordeaux the rights of French citizens, put the finishing touch to this scheme of liberation. But the proposal to extend this privilege to the Jews of Alsace evoked a storm of controversy in the Assembly, and also violent insurrections amongst the Alsatian peasants. It was thus on behalf of the people that several deputies protested against the decree. The Jews, said the Abbé Maury, have traversed 17 centuries without mingling with other nations. They have never done anything but trade with money, they have been the scourge of agricultural provinces, not one of them has known how to ennoble his hands by guiding the plough. And he went on to point out that the Jews must not be persecuted. They must be protected as individuals and not as Frenchmen, since they cannot be citizens. Whatever you do, they will always remain foreigners in our midst. Monseigneur de la Fère, Bishop of Nancy, adopted the same line of argument. They must be accorded protection, safety, liberty, but should we admit into the family a tribe that is foreign to it, that turns its eyes unceasingly towards a common country, that aspires to abandon the land that bears it? My cahier orders me to protest against the motion that has been made to you. The interest of the Jews themselves necessitates this protest. The people have a horror of them. They are often in Alsace the victims of popular risings. In all this, as will be seen, there is no question of persecution, but of precautions against a race that willfully isolates itself from the rest of the community in order to pursue its own interests and advantages. The Jews of Bordeaux indeed recognized the odium that the German Jews were calculated to bring on the Jewish cause, and in an address to the Assembly on January 22, 1790, dissociated themselves from the aggressive claims of the Ashkenazim. We dare to believe that our condition in France would not today be open to discussion if certain demands of the Jews of Alsace, Lorraine, and the Trois Veches, i.e. Metz, Toul, and Verdun, had not caused a confusion of ideas which appears to reflect on us. We do not yet know exactly what these demands are, but to judge by the public papers they appear to be rather extraordinary, since these Jews aspire to live in France under a special regime, to have laws peculiar to themselves, and to constitute a class of citizens separated from all the others. As for us, our condition in France has long since been settled. We have been naturalized French since 1550, we possess all kinds of properties, and we enjoy the unlimited right to acquire estates. We have neither laws, tribunals, nor officers of our own. In adopting this attitude, the Sephardim created a precedent which, if it had been followed henceforth consistently by their co-religionists, might have gone far to allay prejudice against the Jewish race. It was the solidarity generally presented by the Jews towards the rest of the community, which excited alarm in the minds of French citizens. 30 years earlier, the merchants of Paris, in a petition against the admission of the Jews to their corporations, indicated by an admirable simile the danger this solidarity offered to free commerce. The French merchant carries on his commerce alone. Each commercial house is in a way isolated, whilst the Jews are particles of quicksilver, which at the least slant run together into a block. But in spite of all protests, the decree emancipating the Jews of Alsace was passed in September 1791, and hymns of praise were sung in the synagogues. What part was actually played by the Jews in the tumults of the Revolution, it is impossible to determine, for the reason that they are seldom designated as such in the writings of contemporaries. On this point Jewish writers appear to be better informed than the rest of the world, for Monsieur Leon Kahn in his panegyric on the part played by his co-religionists in the Revolution finds Jews where even Drumont failed to detect them. Thus we read that it was a Jew, Rosenthal, who headed the legion known by his name, which was sent against La Vendée, but took to flight, and which was the subject of complaint when employed to guard the royal family at the temple, that amongst those who worked most energetically to deprive the clergy of their goods was a Jewish old Claudia's seller. Zalk and Auerwitz, that it was a Jew named Lang who murdered 3 out of the 5 Swiss guards at the foot of the staircase in the Tuileries on August 10, that Jews were implicated in the theft of the crown jewels on September 16, 1792. And one named Liar was executed in consequence, that it was Klutz and the Jew Pereira, and not, as I had stated, Hébert, Chaumet, and Montmoreau, who went to the Archbishop Goebel in November 1793, and induced him by means of threats to abjure the Christian faith. All these facts were unknown to me when I wrote my account of these events. It will be seen then that, far from exaggerating the role of the Jews in the French Revolution, I very much underrated it. Indeed, the question of their complicity had not occurred to me at all when I wrote this book, and the only Jew to whom I referred was Ephraim sent to France by the Illuminati Frederick William II and Bischofswerder, whom M. Kahn indicates as playing an even more important part than I had assigned to him. But illuminating as these incidents may be, it is yet open to question whether they prove any concerted attempt on the part of the Jews to bring about the overthrow of the French monarchy and the Catholic religion. It is true, nevertheless, that they themselves boasted of their revolutionary ardor. In an address presenting their claims before the National Assembly in 1789, they declare, "Regenerators of the French Empire, you would not wish that we should cease to be citizens, since for already 6 months we have assiduously performed all duties as such. And the recompense for the zeal we have shown in accelerating the revolution will not be to condemn us to participate in none of its advantages now that it has been consummated. Monseigneurs, we are all very good citizens, and in this memorable revolution we dare to say that there is not one of us who has not proved himself." In all these activities, however, religious feeling appears to have played an entirely subordinate part. The Jews, as has been said, were free before the revolution to carry on the rites of their faith. And when the great anti-religious campaign began, many of them entered wholeheartedly into the attack on all religious faiths, their own included. Thus on the 21st Brumaire, whilst the feasts of reason were taking place in the churches of Paris, we find a deputation of Israelites presenting themselves at the National Assembly and depositing on the bosom of the mountain the ornaments of which they had stripped a little temple they had in the Faubourg Saint-Germain. At the same moment, a revolutionary committee of the Reunion brings to the General Council crosses, suns, chalices, copes, and quantities of other ornaments of worship, and a member of this committee observes that several of these effects belong to individuals of the Jewish race. A minister of the religion of Moses, Abraham, and Jacob asks in the name of his co-religionists that the said effects should not be regarded as belonging to such and such a sect. This citizen is named Benjamin Jacob. Another member of the same committee pays homage to the patriotic zeal of the citizens heretofore Jews. Almost all have forestalled the wish of the revolutionary committee by themselves bringing their reliquaries and ornaments, amongst others the famous cope said to have belonged to Moses. On the 20th Brumaire at the Temple of Liberty, formerly the Church of the Benedictines, the citizen Alexander Lambert Fills, a Jew brought up in the prejudices of the Jewish religion, uttered a violent harangue against all religions. I will prove to you, citizens, that all forms of worship are impostures equally degrading to man and to divinities. I will not prove it by philosophy, I do not know it, but only by the light of reason. After denouncing the iniquities of both the Catholic and Protestant faiths, Lambert demonstrates the absurdities of the Jewish religion, of this domineering religion. He thunders against Moses governing a simple and agrarian people like all clever impostors, against the servile respect of the Jews for their kings, the ablutions of women, etc. Finally he declares, the bad faith, citizens, of which the Jewish nation is accused does not come from themselves, but from their priests. Their religion, which would allow them only to lend to those of their nation 5%, tells them to take all they can from Catholics. It is even hallowed as a custom in our morning prayers to solicit God's help in catching out a Christian. There is more, citizens, and it is the climax of abomination. If any mistake is made in commerce between Jews, they are ordered to make reparation. But if on 100 louis a Christian should have paid 25 too much, one is not bound to return them to him. What an abomination! What a horror! And where does that all come from but from the rabbis, who have excited proscriptions against us? Our priests. Ah, citizens, more than anything in the world we must abjure a religion which, by subjecting us to irksome and servile practices, makes it impossible for us to be good citizens. The encouragement accorded by the Jews to the French Revolution appears thus to have been prompted not by religious fanaticism, but by a desire for national advantage. That they gained immensely by the overthrow of the old order is undeniable, for apart from the legislation passed on their behalf in the National Assembly, the disorder of the finances in 1796 was such that, as M. Loncon tells us, a contemporary journal inquired, has the revolution then been only a financial scheme? A speculation of bankers? Oh, we know from Prudhomme to what race the financiers who principally profited by this disorder belonged. But if the role of the Jews in the revolution remains obscure, there can be no doubt of the part played by the secret societies in the revolt against all religion, all moral laws, and social order, which had been reduced to a system in the councils of the Illuminati. It was this conspiracy that reasserted itself in the Babouvist Rising of 1796, which was directly inspired by the secret societies. After the death of Babeuf, his friend and inspirer Buonarroti, with the aid of Marat's brother, founded a Masonic lodge, the Amos Sincères, which was affiliated to the Philadelphia Delphs at Geneva, and as Diaker Mobile of the Order of Sublime and Perfect Masons created 3 new secret degrees, in which the device of the Rose-Croix INRI was interpreted as signifying Justum Nequer Regis Injustos. The part to be assigned to each intrigue in preparing the world movement of which the French Revolution was the first expression is a question on which no one can speak with certainty. But, as at the present moment, the composite nature of this movement must never be lost to sight. Largely perhaps the work of Frederick the Great, it is probable that, but for the Orleanists the plot against the French monarchy might have come to naught, whilst again. But for his position as the head of Illuminized Freemasonry, it is doubtful whether the Duc d'Orléans could have commanded the forces of Revolution. Further, how far the movement, which, like the modern Bolshevist conspiracy, appears to have had unlimited funds at its disposal, was financed by the Jews yet remains to be discovered. Hitherto only the first steps have been taken towards elucidating the truth about the French Revolution. In the opinion of an early 19th century writer, the sect which engineered the French Revolution was absolutely international. The authors of the Revolution are not more French than German, Italian, English, etc. They form a particular nation which took birth, and has grown in the darkness, in the midst of all civilized nations, with the object of subjecting them to its domination. It is curious to find almost precisely the same idea expressed by the Duke of Brunswick, formerly the Iques of Victoria of the strict observance, Aaron of the Illuminati, and Grand Master of German Freemasonry, who, whether because the Revolution had done its work in destroying the French monarchy, and now threatened the security of Germany, or whether because he was genuinely disillusioned in the orders to which he had belonged, issued a manifesto to all the lodges in 1794, declaring that in view of the way in which Masonry had been penetrated by this great sect, the whole order must be temporarily suppressed. It is essential to quote a part of this important document verbatim. Amidst the universal storm produced by the present revolutions in the political and moral world, at this period of supreme illumination and of profound blindness, it would be a crime against truth and humanity to leave any longer shrouded in a veil things that can provide the only key to past and future events, things that should show to thousands of men whether the path they have been made to follow is the path of folly or of wisdom. It has to do with you, VV. FF. Of all degrees and of all secret systems. The curtain must at last be drawn aside, so that your blinded eyes may see that light you have ever sought in vain, but of which you have only caught a few deceptive rays. We have raised our building under the wings of darkness. The darkness is dispelled, and a light more terrifying than darkness itself strikes suddenly on our sight. We see our edifice crumbling and covering the ground with ruins, we see destruction that our hands can no longer arrest. And that is why we send away the builders from their workshops. With a last blow of the hammer we overthrow the columns of salaries. We leave the temple deserted, and we bequeath it as a great work to posterity, which shall raise it again on its ruins and bring it to completion. Brunswick then goes on to explain what has brought about the ruin of the order, namely, the infiltration of Freemasonry by secret conspirators. A great sect arose which, taking for its motto the good and the happiness of man, worked in the darkness of the conspiracy to make the happiness of humanity a prey for itself. This sect is known to every one, its brothers are known no less than its name. It is they who have undermined the foundations of the order to the point of complete overthrow. It is by them that all humanity has been poisoned and led astray for several generations. The ferment that reigns amongst the peoples is their work. They founded the plans of their insatiable ambition on the political pride of nations. Their founders arranged to introduce this pride into the heads of the peoples. They began by casting odium on religion. They invented the rights of man which it is impossible to discover even in the book of nature, and they urged the people to wrest from their princes the recognition of these supposed rights. The plan they had formed for breaking all social ties and of destroying all order was revealed in all their speeches and acts. They deluged the world with a multitude of publications. They recruited apprentices of every rank and in every position. They deluded the most perspicacious men by falsely alleging different intentions. They sowed in the hearts of youth the seed of covetousness, and they excited it with the bait of the most insatiable passions. Indomitable pride, thirst of power, such were the only motives of this sect. Their masters had nothing less in view than the thrones of the earth, and the government of the nations was to be directed by their nocturnal clubs. This is what has been done, and is still being done. But we notice that princes and people are unaware how and by what means this is being accomplished. That is why we say to them in all frankness, the misuse of our order, the misunderstanding of our secret, has produced all the political and moral troubles with which the world is filled today. You who have been initiated, you must join yourselves with us in raising your voices, so as to teach peoples and princes that the sectarians, the apostates of our order, have alone been, and will be the authors of present and future revolutions. We must assure princes and peoples, on our honor and our duty, that our association is in no way guilty of these evils. But in order that our attestations should have force and merit belief, we must make for princes and people a complete sacrifice, so as to cut out to the roots the abuse and error. We must from this moment dissolve the whole order. This is why we destroy and annihilate it completely for the time. We will preserve the foundations for posterity, which will clear them when humanity, in better times, can derive some benefit from our holy alliance. Thus, in the opinion of the Grand Master of German Freemasonry, a secret sect working within Freemasonry had brought about the French Revolution, and would be the cause of all future revolutions. We shall now pursue the course of this sect after the first upheaval had ended. 3 years after the Duke of Brunswick issued his manifesto to the lodges, the books of Berulle, Robeson, and others appeared, laying bare the whole conspiracy. It has been said that all these books fell flat. This is directly contrary to the truth. Berulle's book went into no less than 8 editions, and I have described elsewhere the alarm that his work and Robeson's excited in America. In England they led to the very tangible result that a law was passed by the English Parliament in 1799 prohibiting all secret societies, with the exception of Freemasonry. It is evident, then, that the British government recognized the continued existence of these associations, and the danger they presented to the world. This fact should be borne in mind when we are assured that Berulle and Robeson had conjured up a bogey, which met with no serious attention from responsible men. For the main purpose of Berulle's book is to show that not only had Illuminism and Grand Orient Masonry contributed largely to the French Revolution, but that 3 years after that first explosion they were still as active as ever. This is the great point which the champions of the bogey theory are most anxious to refute. The Bavarian Order of the Illuminati, wrote Mr. Waite, was founded by Adam Weishaupt in 1776, and it was suppressed by the Elector of Bavaria in 1789. Those who say that it was continued in more secret forms have never produced one item of real evidence. Now, as we have seen, the Illuminati were not suppressed by the Elector of Bavaria in 1789, but in 1786. First error of Mr. Waite. But more extraordinary confusion of mind is displayed in his Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, where, in a Masonic chronology, he gives, this time under the date of 1784, suppression of the Illuminati, but under 1793, C. Bode joined the Illuminati under Weishaupt. As a matter of fact, this was the year Bode died. These examples will serve to show the reliance that can be placed on Mr. Waite's statement concerning the Illuminati. We shall now see that not only the Illuminati, but Weishaupt himself still continued to intrigue long after the French Revolution had ended. Directly the Reign of Terror was over, the Masonic lodges, which during the Revolution had been replaced by the clubs, began to reopen, and by the beginning of the 19th century were in a more flourishing condition than ever before. It was the most brilliant epoch of Masonry, wrote the Freemason Bazet in his History of Freemasonry. Nearly 1,200 lodges existed in France under the Empire. Generals, magistrates, artists, savants, and notabilities in every line were initiated into the order. The most eminent of these was Prince Cambyses, Pro-Grand Master of the Grand Orient. It is in the midst of this period that we find Weishaupt once more at work behind the scenes of Freemasonry. Thus in the remarkable Masonic correspondence published by M. Benjamin Fabre in his Equasa Capite Galato, of which, as has already been pointed out, the authenticity is admitted by eminent British Freemasons, a letter is reproduced from Pyrrhon, representative in Paris of the Grand Orient of Italy, to the Marquis de Chefdebien, dated September 9, 1808, in which it is stated that a member of the sect of Bauve has asked for information on a certain point of ritual. On December 29, 1808, Pyrrhon writes again, F by the word sect of B. I meant W. And on December 3, 1809, puts the matter quite plainly. The other word remaining at the end of my pen refers enigmatically to Weiss equals PT. So, as M. Fabre points out, there is no longer any doubt that it is a question here of Weishaupt, and yet one observes that his name is not yet written in all its letters. It must be admitted here that Pyrrhon took great precautions when it was a matter of Weishaupt. And one is led to ask what could be the extraordinary importance of the role played at this moment in the Freemasonry of the First Empire by this Weishaupt, who was supposed to have been outside the Masonic movement since Illuminism was brought to trial in 1786. But the Marquis de Chefdebien entertained no illusions about Weishaupt, whose intrigues he had always opposed, and in a letter dated May 12, 1806, to the Freemason Recetiers, who had referred to the danger of isolated Masonic lodges, he asks, in good faith, very reverend brother, is it in isolated lodges that the atrocious conspiracy of Philippe, the Duc d'Orléans, and Robespierre was formed? Is it from isolated lodges that those prominent men came forth, who, assembled at the Hôtel de Ville, stirred up revolt, devastation, assassination? And is it not in the lodges bound together, and subordinated, that the monster Weishaupt established his tests, and had his horrible principles prepared? If, then, as M. Gustave Borde asserts, the Marquis de Chefdebien had himself belonged to the Illuminati before the Revolution, here is indeed a luminous evidence in support of Berulle. Yet disillusioned as the Equasa Capite Galato appears to have been with regard to Illuminism, he still retained his allegiance to Freemasonry. This would tend to prove that, however subversive the doctrines of the Grand Orient may have been, and indeed undoubtedly were, it was not Freemasonry itself, but Illuminism, which organized the movement of which the French Revolution was the first manifestation. As Monsignor Dillon has expressed it, had Weishaupt not lived, Masonry might have ceased to be a power after the reaction consequent on the French Revolution. He gave it a form and character which caused it to outlive that reaction, to energize to the present day, and which will cause it to advance until its final conflict with Christianity must determine whether Christ or Satan shall reign on this earth to the end. If to the word Masonry we add Grand Orient, that is to say, the Masonry not of Great Britain, but of the continent, we shall be still nearer to the truth. In the early part of the 19th century, Illuminism, was thus as much alive as ever. Joseph de Maistre, writing at this period, constantly refers to the danger it presents to Europe. Is it not also to Illuminism that a mysterious passage in a recent work of M. Lenotre refers? In the course of conversation with the friends of the false Dauphin Hervagault, Monseigneur de Savin is said to have made allusions in prudent and almost terrified terms to some international sect, a power superior to all others, which has arms and eyes everywhere, and which governs Europe today. When in World Revolution I asserted that during the period that Napoleon held the reins of power the devastating fire of Illuminism was temporarily extinguished. I wrote without knowledge of some important documents which prove that Illuminism continued without break from the date of its foundation all through the period of the Empire. So far, then, from overstating the case by saying that Illuminism did not cease in 1786, I understated it by suggesting that it ceased even for this brief interval. The documents in which this evidence is to be found are referred to by Lombard de Langres, who, writing in 1820, observes that the Jacobins were invisible from the 18th Brumaire until 1813, and goes on to say, "Here the sect disappears. We find to guide us during this period only uncertain notions, scattered fragments. The plots of Illuminism lie buried in the boxes of the imperial police. But the contents of these boxes no longer lie buried, transported to the Archives Nationales, the documents in which the intrigues of Illuminism are laid bare have at last been given to the public. Here there can be no question of imaginative abbés, Scotch professors, or American divines conjuring up a bogey to alarm the world. These dry official reports prepared for the vigilant eye of the Emperor, never intended and never used for publication, relate calmly and dispassionately what the writers have themselves heard and observed concerning the danger that Illuminism presents to all forms of settled government." The author of the most detailed report is one François Charles de Berkham, Special Commissioner of Police at Mayence towards the end of the Empire, who as a Freemason is naturally not disposed to prejudice against secret societies. In October 1810 he writes, however, that his attention has been drawn to the Illuminati by a pamphlet which has just fallen into his hands, namely the Essai sur la secte illumines, which, like many contemporaries, he attributes originally to Mirabeau. He then goes on to ask whether the sect still exists, and if so whether it is indeed an association of frightful scoundrels who aim, as Mirabeau assures us, at the overthrow of all law and all morality, at replacing virtue by crime in every act of human life further. He asks whether both sects of Illumines have now combined in one, and what are their present projects. Conversations with other Freemasons further increase Berkham's anxiety on the subject. One of the best informed observes to him, "I know a great deal, enough at any rate to be convinced that the Illumines have vowed the overthrow of monarchic governments and of all authority on the same basis." Berkham thereupon sets out to make inquiries, with the result that he is able to state that the Illumines have initiates all over Europe, that they have spared no efforts to introduce their principles into the lodges, and to spread a doctrine subversive of all settled government. Under the pretext of the regeneration of social morality, and the amelioration of the lot and condition of men by means of laws founded on principles and sentiments unknown hitherto, and contained only in the heads of the leaders, Illuminism, he declares, is becoming a great and formidable power, and I fear, in my conscience, that kings and peoples will have much to suffer from it unless foresight and prudence break its frightful mechanism, SES Afros Resorts. 2 years later, on January 16, 1813, Berkham writes again to the Minister of Police. "Monseigneur, they write to me from Heidelberg that a great number of initiates into the mysteries of Illuminism are to be found there. These gentlemen wear as a sign of recognition a gold ring on the third finger of the left hand, On the back of this ring there is a little rose. In the middle of this rose is an almost imperceptible dint. By pressing this with the point of a pin one touches a spring. By this means the two gold circles are detached. On the inside of the first of these circles is the device, "Be German as you ought to be." On the inside of the second of these circles are engraved the words "Pro Patria." Subversive as the ideas of the Illuminati might be, they were therefore not subversive of German patriotism. We shall find this apparent paradox running all through the Illuminist movement to the present day. In 1814 Durkheim drew up his great report on the secret societies of Germany, which is of so much importance in throwing a light on the workings of the modern revolutionary movement, that extracts must be given here at length. His testimony gains greater weight from the vagueness he displays on the origins of Illuminism, and the role it had played before the French Revolution. It is evident, therefore, that he had not taken his ideas from Robison or Beruel, to whom he never once refers, but from information gleaned on the spot in Germany. The opening paragraphs finally refute the fallacy concerning the extinction of the sect in 1786. The oldest and most dangerous association is that which is generally known under the denomination of the Illumines, and of which the foundation goes back towards the middle of the last century. Bavaria was its cradle. It is said that it had for founders several chiefs of the order of the Jesuits, but this opinion, advanced perhaps at random, is founded only on uncertain premises. In any case, in a short time it made rapid progress, and the Bavarian government recognized the necessity of employing methods of repression against it, and even of driving away several of the principal sectaries. But it could not eradicate the germ of the evil. The Illuminis who remained in Bavaria, obliged to wrap themselves in darkness so as to escape the eye of authority, became only the more formidable, the rigorous measures of which they were the object, adorned by the title of persecution, gained them new proselytes, whilst the banished members went to carry the principles of the association into other states. Thus in a few years Illuminism multiplied its hotbeds all through the south of Germany, and as a consequence in Saxony, in Prussia, in Sweden, and even in Russia. The reveries of the Pietists have long been confounded with those of the Illumines. This error may arise from the denomination of the sect, which at first suggests the idea of a purely religious fanaticism, and of mystic forms which it was obliged to take at its birth in order to conceal its principles and projects, but the association always had a political tendency. If it still retains some mystic traits, it is in order to support itself at need by the power of religious fanaticism, and we shall see in what follows how well it knows to turn this to account. The doctrine of Illuminism is subversive of every kind of monarchy, unlimited liberty, absolute leveling down. Such is the fundamental dogma of the sect, to break the ties that bind the sovereign to the citizen of a state, that is the object of all its efforts. No doubt some of the principal chiefs, amongst whom are numbered men distinguished for their fortune, their birth, and the dignities with which they are invested, are not the dupes of these demagogic dreams. They hope to find in the popular emotions they stir up the means of seizing the reins of power, or at any rate of increasing their wealth and their credit, but the crowd of adepts believe in it religiously, and, in order to reach the goal shown to them, they maintain incessantly a hostile attitude towards sovereigns. Thus the Illumines hailed with enthusiasm the ideas that prevailed in France from 1789 to 1804. Perhaps they were not foreign to the intrigues which prepared the explosions of 1789 and the following years, but if they did not take an active part in these maneuvers, it is at least beyond doubt that they openly applauded the systems which resulted from them, that the Republican armies, when they penetrated into Germany, found in these sectarians auxiliaries the more dangerous for the sovereigns of the invaded states in that they inspired no distrust, And we can say with assurance that more than one general of the Republic owed a part of his success to his understanding with the Illuminates. It would be a mistake if one confounded Illuminism with Freemasonry. These two associations, in spite of the points of resemblance they may possess in the mystery with which they surround themselves, in the tests that precede initiation, and in other matters of form, are absolutely distinct, and have no kind of connection with each other. The lodges of the Scottish Rite number, it is true, a few Illuminates amongst the Masons of a higher degrees, but these adepts are very careful not to be known as such to their brothers in Masonry, or to manifest ideas that would betray their secret. Durkheim then goes on to describe the subtle methods by which the Illuminati now maintain their existence. Learning wisdom from the events of 1786, their organization is carried on invisibly, so as to defy the eye of authority. It was thought for a long while that the association had a grand mastership, that is to say, a center point from which radiated all the impulsions given to this great body, and this primary motive power was sought for successively in all the capitals of the North, in Paris, and even in Rome. This error gave birth to another opinion no less fallacious. It was supposed that there existed in the principal towns lodges where initiations were made, and which received directly the instructions emanating from the headquarters of the society. If such had been the organization of Illuminism, it would not so long have escaped the investigations of which it was the object. These meetings, necessarily thronged and frequent, requiring besides, like Masonic lodges, appropriate premises, would have aroused the attention of magistrates. It would not have been difficult to introduce false brothers, who, directed and protected by authority, would soon have penetrated the secrets of the sect. This is what I have gathered most definitely on the association of the Illumines. First, I would point out that by the word hotbeds, foyers, I did not mean to designate points of meeting for the adepts, places where they hold assemblies, but only localities where the association counts a great number of partisans, who, whilst living isolated in appearance, exchange ideas, have an understanding with each other, and advance together towards the same goal. The association had, it is true, assemblies at its birth where receptions, i.e. initiations, took place, but the dangers which resulted from these made them feel the necessity of abandoning them. It was settled that each initiated adept should have the right, without the help of anyone else, to initiate all those who, after the usual tests, seemed to him worthy. The catechism of the sect is composed of a very small number of articles, which might even be reduced to this single principle: to arm the opinion of the peoples against sovereigns, and to work, by every method, for the fall of monarchic governments, in order to found in their place systems of absolute independence. Everything that can tend towards this object is in the spirit of the association. Initiations are not accompanied, as in Masonry, by phantasmagoric trials, but they are preceded by long moral tests, which guarantee in the safest way the fidelity of the catechumen, oaths, a mixture of all that is most sacred in religion, threats and imprecations against traitors. Nothing that can stagger the imagination is spared, but the only engagement into which the recipient enters is to propagate the principles with which he has been imbued, to maintain inviolable secrecy on all that pertains to the association, and to work with all his might to increase the number of proselytes. It will no doubt seem astonishing that there can be the least accord in the association, and that men bound together by no physical tie, and who live at great distances from each other, can communicate their ideas to each other, make plans of conduct, and give grounds of fear to governments, but there exists an invisible chain which binds together all the scattered members of the association. Here are a few links. All the adepts living in the same town usually know each other, unless the population of the town, or the number of the adepts, is too considerable. In this last case they are divided into several groups, who are all in touch with each other by means of members of the association whom personal relations bind to two or several groups at a time. These groups are again subdivided into so many private coteries which the difference of rank, of fortune, of character, tastes, etc., may necessitate. They are always small, sometimes composed of 5 or 6 individuals, who meet frequently under various pretexts. Sometimes at the house of one member, sometimes at that of another. Literature, art, amusements of all kinds are the apparent object of these meetings, and it is nevertheless in these confabulations, conciliabules, that the adepts communicate their private views to each other, agree on methods, receive the directions that the intermediaries bring them, and communicate their own ideas to these same intermediaries, who then go on to propagate them in other coteries. It will be understood that there may be uniformity in the march of all these separated groups, and that one day may suffice to communicate the same impulses to all the quarters of a large town. These are the methods by which the alumni-SS, without any apparent organization, without settled leaders, agree together from the banks of the Rhine to those of the Neva, from the Baltic to the Dardanelles, and advance continually towards the same goal, without leaving any trace that might compromise the interests of the association, or even bring suspicion on any of its members. The most active police would fail before such a combination. As the principal force of the illumines lies in the power of opinions, they have set themselves out from the beginning to make proselytes amongst the men who through their profession exercise a direct influence on minds, such as littérateurs, savants, and above all professors. The latter in their chairs, the former in their writings, propagate the principles of the sect by disguising the poison that they circulate under 1,000 different forms. These germs, often imperceptible to the eyes of the vulgar, are afterwards developed by the adepts of the societies they frequent, and the most obscure wording is thus brought to the understanding of the least discerning. It is above all in the universities that Illuminism has always found, and always will find, numerous recruits. Those professors who belong to the association set out from the first to study the character of their pupils. If a student gives evidence of a vigorous mind, an ardent imagination, the sectaries at once get hold of him. They sound in his ears the words despotism, tyranny, rights of the people, etc., etc. Before he can even attach any meaning to these words, as he advances in age, reading chosen for him, conversations skillfully arranged, develop the germs deposited in his youthful brain. Soon his imagination ferments, history, traditions of fabulous times, all are made use of to carry his exaltation to the highest point, and before even he has been told of a secret association, to contribute to the fall of a sovereign appears to his eyes the noblest and most meritorious act. At last, when he has been completely captivated, when several years of testing guarantee to the society inviolable secrecy and absolute devotion, it is made known to him that millions of individuals distributed in all the states of Europe share his sentiments and his hopes, that a secret link binds firmly all the scattered members of this immense family, and that the reforms he desires so ardently must sooner or later come about. This propaganda is rendered the easier by the existing associations of students who meet together for the study of literature, for fencing, gaming, or even mere debauchery. The illumines insinuate themselves into all these circles and turn them into hot-beds for the propagation of their principles. Such, then, is the association's continual mode of progression from its origins until the present moment. It is by conveying from childhood the germ of poison into the highest classes of society, in feeding the minds of students on ideas diametrically opposed to that order of things under which they have to live, in breaking the ties that bind them to sovereigns, that Illuminism has recruited the largest number of adepts, called by the state to which they were bound to be the mainstays of the throne, and of a system which would ensure them honors and privileges. Amongst the proselytes of this last class there are some no doubt whom political events, the favor of the prince, or other circumstances detach from the association, but the number of these deserters is necessarily very limited, and even then they dare not speak openly against their old associates, whether because they are in dread of private vengeances, or whether because, knowing the real power of the sect, they want to keep paths of reconciliation open to themselves. Often indeed they are so fettered by the pledges they have personally given that they find it necessary not only to consider the interests of the sect, but to serve it indirectly, although their new circumstances demand the contrary. Durkheim then proceeds to show that those writers on Illuminism were mistaken, who declared that political assassinat-ins were definitely commanded by the order. There is more than exaggeration in this accusation. Those who put it forward, more zealous in striking an effect than in seeking the truth, may have concluded, not without probability, that men who surrounded themselves with profound mystery, who propagated a doctrine absolutely subversive of any kind of monarchy, dreamt only of the assassination of sovereigns, but experience has shown, and all the documents derived from the least suspect sources confirm this, that the Illumines count a great deal more on the power of opinion than on assassination. The regicide committed on Gustavus III is perhaps the only crime of this kind that Illuminism has dared to attempt, if indeed it is really proof that this crime was its work. Moreover, if assassination had been, as it is said, the fundamental point in its doctrine, might we not suppose that other regicides would have been attempted in Germany during the course of the French Revolution, especially when the Republican armies occupied the country? The sect would be much less formidable if this were its doctrine, on the one hand, because it would inspire in most of the Illumines a feeling of horror, which would triumph even over the fear of vengeance. On the other hand, because plots and conspiracies always leave some traces which guide the authorities to the footsteps of the prime instigators, and besides, it is the nature of things that out of 20 plots directed against sovereigns, 19 come to light before they have reached the point of maturity necessary to their execution. The Illuminati line of march is more prudent, more skillful, and consequently more dangerous. Instead of revolting the imagination by ideas of regicide, they affect the most generous sentiments, declamations on the unhappy state of the people, on the selfishness of courtiers, on measures of administration, on all acts of authority that may offer a pretext to declamations as a contrast to the seductive pictures of the felicity that awaits the nations under the systems they wish to establish, such is their manner of procedure, particularly in private. More circumspect in their writings, they usually disguise the poison they dare not proffer openly under obscure metaphysics or more or less ingenious allegories. Often indeed texts from Holy Writ serve as an envelope and vehicle for these baneful insinuations. By this continuous and insidious form of propaganda, the imagination of the adepts is so worked on that if a crisis arises, they are ready to carry out the most daring projects. Another association closely resembling the Illumines, Durkheim reports, is known as the Idealists, whose system is founded on the doctrine of perfectibility. These kindred sects agree in seeing in the words of Holy Scripture the pledge of universal regeneration, of an absolute leveling down. And it is in this spirit that the sectarians interpret the sacred books. Durkheim further confirms the assertion I made in World Revolution, contested, as usual, by a reviewer without a shred of evidence to the contrary, that the Tugendbund derived from the Illuminati. The League of Virtue, he writes, was directed by the secondary chiefs of the Illumines. In 1810 the Friends of Virtue were so identified with the Illumines in the north of Germany that no line of demarcation was seen between them. But it is time to turn to the testimony of another witness on the activities of the secret societies, which is likewise to be found at the Archives Nationales. This consists of a document transmitted by the Court of Vienna to the government of France after the Restoration, and contains the interrogatory of a certain Witt Doring, a nephew of the Baron d'Eckstein, who, after taking part in secret society intrigues, was summoned before the Judge Abel at Bayreuth in February 1824. Amongst secret associations recently existing in Germany, the witness asserted, were the Independents and the Absolutes, the latter adored in Robespierre their most perfect ideal. So that the crimes committed during the French Revolution by this monster, and the Montagnards of the Convention were in their eyes, in accordance with their moral system, heroic actions ennobled and sanctified by their aim. The same document goes on to explain why so many combustible elements had failed to produce an explosion in Germany. The thing that seemed the great obstacle to the plans of the Independents was what they called the servile character and the dog-like fidelity, Hundestro, of the German people, that is to say, that attachment innate and firmly impressed on their minds without even the aid of reason which that excellent people everywhere bears towards its princes. A traveler in Germany during the year 1795 admirably summed up the matter in these words. The Germans are in this respect, of democracy, the most curious people in the world. The cold and sober temperament of the Germans, and their tranquil imagination enable them to combine the most daring opinions with the most servile conduct. That will explain to you why so much combustible material accumulating for so many years beneath the political edifice of Germany has not yet damaged it. Most of the princes, accustomed to see their men of letters so constantly free in their writings, and so constantly slavish in their hearts, have not thought it necessary to use severity against this sheep-like herd of modern Gracchi and Brutuses. Some of them, the princes, have even without difficulty adopted part of their opinions, and Illuminism having doubtless been presented to them as perfection, the complement of philosophy, they were easily persuaded to be initiated into it. But great care was taken not to let them know more than the interests of the sect demanded. It was thus that Illuminism, unable to provoke a blaze in the home of its birth, spread, as before the French Revolution, to a more inflammable Latin race, this time the Italians. 6 years after his interrogatory at Bayreuth, Whitdoring published his book on the secret societies of France and Italy, in which he now realized he had played the part of dupe, and incidentally confirms the statement I have previously quoted, that the Alta Vendita was a further development of the Illuminati. This infamous association, with which I have dealt at length elsewhere, constituted the supreme directory of the Carbonari, and was led by a group of Italian noblemen, amongst whom a prince, the profoundest of initiates, was charged as Inspector General of the order to propagate its principles throughout the north of Europe. He had received from the hands of King Einig, the ally of Weishaupt, the kayas of the last 3 degrees. But these were of course unknown to the great majority of Carbonari, who entered the association in all good faith. Whitdoring then shows how faithfully the system of Weishaupt was carried out by the Alta Vendita. In the 3 first degrees, he explains, it is still a question of the morality of Christianity, and even of the Church, for which those who wish to be received must promise to sacrifice themselves. The initiates imagine, according to this formula, that the object of the association is something high and noble, that it is the order of those who desire a purer morality, and a stronger piety, the independence and the unity of their country. One cannot therefore judge the Carbonari en masse, there are excellent men amongst them. But everything changes after one has taken the 3 degrees. Already in the 4th, in that of the Apostoli, one promises to overthrow all monarchies, and especially the kings of the race of the Bourbons. But it is only in the 7th and last degree, reached by few, that revelations go further. At last the veil is torn completely for the Principi Sumo Patriarcho. Then one learns that the aim of the Carbonari is just the same as that of the Iumenes. This degree, in which a man is at the same time prince and bishop, coincides with the homo rex of the latter. The initiate vows the ruin of all religion and of all positive government, whether despotic or democratic. Murder, poison, perjury, are all at their disposal. Who does not remember that on the suppression of the illumines was found, amongst other poisons, a tinctura ad abortum faciendum? The Sumo Maestro laughs at the zeal of the mass of Carbonari, who have sacrificed themselves for the liberty and independence of Italy, neither one nor the other being for him a goal but a method. Witt-Doring, who had himself reached the degree of PSP, thereupon declares that, having taken his vows under a misapprehension, he holds himself to be released from his obligations and conceives it his duty to warn society. The fears that assail governments are only too well founded. The soil of Europe is volcanic. It is unnecessary to go over the ground already traversed in world revolution, by relating the history of the successive eruptions, which proved the truth of Witt-Doring's warning. The point to emphasize again is that every one of these eruptions can be traced to the work of the secret societies, and that, as in the 18th century, most of the prominent revolutionaries were known to be connected with some secret association. According to the plan laid down by Weishaupt, Freemasonry was habitually adopted as a cover. Thus Louis Blanc, himself a Freemason, speaks of a lodge named the Amos de la Vérité, numbering Bazard and Bucquez amongst its founders, in which the solemn puerilities of the Grand Orient only served to mask political action. 1-2 Bakunin, companion of the Freemason Proudhon, the father of anarchy, makes use of precisely the same expression. Freemasonry, he explains, is not to be taken seriously, but may serve as a mask, and as a means for preparing something quite different. I have quoted elsewhere the statement of the socialist Malin that Bakunin was a disciple of Weishaupt, and that of the anarchist Kropotkin, that between Bakunin's secret society, the Alliance Sociale Démocratique, and the secret societies of 1795 there was a direct affiliation. I have quoted the assertion of Malin that communism was handed down in the dark through the secret societies of the 19th century. I have quoted also the congratulations addressed by Lamartine and the Freemason Crémieux to the Freemasons of France in 1848 on their share in this revolution, as in that of 1789. I have shown that the organization of this later outbreak by the secret societies is not a matter of surmise, but a fact admitted by all well-informed historians, and by the members of the secret societies themselves. So too, in the events of the Commune, and in the founding of the First Internationale, the role of Freemasonry and the secret societies is no less apparent. The Freemasons of France have indeed always boasted of their share in political and social upheavals. Thus in 1874, Malapert, orator of the Supreme Council of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, went so far as to say, in the 18th century Freemasonry was so widespread throughout the world that one can say that since that epoch nothing has been done without its consent. The secret history of Europe during the last 200 years yet remains to be written. Until viewed in the light of the Decis Descartes, many events that have taken place during this period must remain forever incomprehensible. But it is time to leave the past and consider the secret forces at work in the world today.